Welcome to 5 a.m. Tuesday, where we unlock the power of choice to shape and transform your life one Tuesday at a time. Well, welcome, listeners, to another episode. I am pretty excited today because we're joined by Vince Ford. Hi, Vince. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. Now, I would have to say, if I was to describe your career, I would say it's been very adventurous. And, Vince's work as a jackaroo in Outback Australia. He's spent time as a stay-at-home dad, and he's led four-wheel drive trips in the UAE and Qatar, which just sounds so exciting. But one of his massive achievements is that Vince is an award-winning author. So he's published 16 novels for children's and teens. Is that right? 16?
Yeah.
16. He's spoken to thousands of children through the Writers' Schools program. He's president of Tauranga Toastmasters. He's a member of Professional Speakers. And, what excites me is really, Vince, your latest project. So you've been busy researching and writing for your next book that you're titling Unite, Bring People Together Through Story. Now, this all focuses listeners on social connection. And Vince's work is taking him more and more into working with businesses and even teachers in some instances on storytelling. So he runs storytelling coaching and workshops. It's a big need out there. And he's really put together, well, the book will come out. So we might talk about when that might happen. I know you're in the process of writing. But this idea of storytelling has been talked about a bit. And we've just had a talk beforehand, and I love your take on it. I'd be really keen to start off with what actually inspired you to explore how we make these connections through story, or how you landed in researching to write this particular book.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things that led on to that. I suppose, firstly, we'd been living overseas. We were living in the Emirates, and my wife had a contract over there. And we finished up and moved back and built a house out of Tauranga. And I was project managing, so I was full-time on site. I was paying them builders hourly and managing everything. And it was flat out for a couple of years. But the guys would be there every day. I'd be up at the site, and we'd be having smoke over with the guys and having a chat, and just a really nice bunch of guys, and really enjoyed the social part of that. And we finished up, we'd built the house, the guys had left, my wife went to her job, and my daughter went to school, and it was just me and the dog back home. And I sat down to think, right, I'll start writing my next book. And I just felt completely isolated. I didn't really, because I'd been flat out on this project, I didn't know anyone in the community. I just couldn't bear to be sitting inside my head. And then around the same time, I went to a conference, and there was a storytelling workshop within that conference. And we had to share personal stories with a partner. And I looked around and I caught eyes with a woman. She would have been in her 40s, curly hair with glasses. And we'll call her Barbara Kilpatrick, because that's not a real name, but that's what we'll call her. And we ended up sitting, there was a stuffy little room, and we sat in the corridor and we shared personal stories. And Barbara told me about how she grew up with 8 brothers and sisters, and the only places they could find big enough to fit them were old hotels and hostels or haunted houses that were up for sale. So they were constantly moving from place to place, from school to school throughout her childhood. And she ended up giving up on making friends. There was an opportunity to talk to another girl, and she didn't bother because she knew she'd only be moving on anyway. And then explained a lot of who she was. And throughout the rest of that conference, if we saw each other in the atrium or getting a coffee, we'd stop and have a chat. And I realized I'd kind of got a glimpse of the real Barbara Kilpatrick, not just this woman with glasses and curly hair, this 40-year-old woman. I actually saw a little bit of who she was. And I got the feeling that stories didn't just break the ice between us, they completely melted it. And I saw that there was such an opportunity. So I had been starting to read, after that period of building up here, I had been researching connection, and I was seeing information, stuff like Chad Littlefield's done, writes a lot about connection, and he talked about ask powerful questions. And I saw some of the work from Robin Dunbar, and I thought, hang on, there's something missing here. Don't ask powerful questions, ask for story, because story is something that is memorable and it moves us emotionally and it brings people together. So that was something that inspired me to focus on exploring connection through story.
And I think it's so much easier, isn't it, for people to tell a story, really?
Yeah, we've all got our stories, and when rather, and I see so many people giving speeches and they're going through the facts and they're going through the opinion and what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And there's such an opportunity to tell a good story. And as soon as people can start to do that and tell it in first person, a story about you, and tell it in present tense as though it's happening now, and people start to lean forward and they perk up. And it doesn't have to be funny. It helps. Sometimes a good, funny story works. But so long as it's meaningful and it moves people, then it's great. It's great. And you can get your message across so much better.
And it's relevant in every context. If I think about leaders, if you're trying to encourage one of your team members to try something new, you could tell a story about a learning experience or where something went right or wrong for you so they can relate, or even business owners who are trying to develop their business, telling a success story really gives them credibility.
Telling the failure stories better in many ways. A, failure makes a great story. And B, it's vulnerable. The best stories are stories when you fail miserably and things turn to custard. But it's vulnerable and it's showing that you're human, but you can learn from those things too, particularly if you can see your staff members making perhaps the same mistakes or heading down the same path, and you can show your vulnerability and show that you can understand you've been there, you're a real person too, but you can learn from it, and you don't have to have the same issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love what you said quite early on about you didn't just break the ice, you completely melted it. And we can do that with audiences as well, be it one client, a team member, and a big audience, or a child.
Yeah. And once someone is on board with that, and because it's so memorable, and I could tell you why it's so memorable. I won't go into all of that, but because it sticks with you and you have an impression, and if you can fully concentrate and listen to someone for 1 minute, and if someone's telling a story, that's not hard at all, but that memory of that relationship goes for weeks, for months, for years, because you've had that connection and that vibe with that person just switches straight back again. It's a fantastic tool.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious because I talk a lot about self-awareness. And so we all know about telling stories to others, which we're talking about here. But what would your take be on the whole idea of the stories we tell ourselves and how that might influence the choices we make in life?
It's really interesting. So looking at the research, mentalizing is the thing we do when we put ourselves in someone else's shoes. Say if I walked out of the room and I put my pen down, and in the meantime my wife shifts the pen somewhere else, I walk back into the room and I say, well, where do you think I think my pen is? Okay, and so you'll think, I think it's where I left it. It's not actually where it is. And it's kids under the age of 4 or 5 won't get that. It's only after a little while that you're able to put yourself, I see it from Vince's perspective, the pen, he thinks the pen's where he left it, but it's not where it actually is. But then we go on to mentalize, and there's layers and layers of mentalizing, but we get into that habit of thinking what others around us are thinking. And we do it all the time. But when that starts looping out of control, so when my wife's at a conference and I ring her and I can't get her, and I ring her again and I can't get her, and I ring her again, and I think, I didn't compliment her before she left, and she didn't, maybe she doesn't realize how much I love her, and oh my God, there's all these other people at the conference, and she's having an affair. Oh my God, that's not going to work. We're going to have to split up. I'm going to have to get an apartment in town. The dog's not going to be able to come with me. I'm going to have to put the dog down because he's old and I can't take it to an apartment. And you start to buzz all out of control. And that starts with that mentalizing. It's the stories we tell. So the way we make sense of anything in the world, we put it through a story. this is what happens. So stuff happens all the time. But the way the human mind works is we link it. We say, well, this caused that, and then we add a mentalizing factor in there, and then it can all spiral. But when we're able just to say, to get a handle on those stories and say, oh, this is what's happened. Okay. Oh, this is the story I'm telling myself. And if we can pass that on, and if I can say to my wife, oh, the story I was telling myself was that I didn't compliment you, and the fact was that she was in a meeting, she turned her phone on silent and didn't see it, didn't notice that I was calling the whole time, and it's all really straightforward. But just getting a handle on that's our sense making. And one thing that I've found fascinating with mentalizing and thinking about the stuff that happens in our lives. I've got a diary, and this is something that came from a guy called Matthew Dix. And he has a story-worthy moment, and he writes down one moment that's like a moment that you could have a story on it, and it's just a sentence or so in a day. This is a 5-year diary, so in 5 years, I will have the same day every year for 5 years, and I'll be able to look back and see the things that happened. But it's also a really neat way, to interpret your life, but also to have those little points. And if you look back over a week and think all of those little points where something happened, and usually a story is a decision. So I made a decision, something changed because of something that happened. If you look over that, you can see the influence you are having on your life and how you're changing as a result of the experiences you have. I think that's a really cool way to look back at your life and see progress, but also it's those memories as well. People that do nothing, their life just disappears because nothing much has happened. But if you look back and you say, oh, that day that happened, maybe it was one thing. I was at the lights the other day. I pulled up in my van, and there was an elderly couple walking down the street hand in hand. And I thought, oh, that's really cool. But then I saw a woman was behind them on a bicycle. And they'd kind of glanced, the couple had seen me in the van and glanced at me. And I just wound down my window and I said, oh, there's a lady behind you trying to get past. And they looked around, and the woman started to go past. And the woman on the bike said, oh, it was okay. They were happy. I was happy to leave them and just follow them.
Yeah.
It's just a moment like that, but it's a moment that's part of the rich texture of life. And I think just getting a little one of those every day actually helps to interpret life and to see how interesting and exciting and how much you're growing in the course of it.
And that's a fabulous little tool. And for those who are listening rather than watching this on YouTube, Vince held up a little diary where he's written one, what did we call it, story-worthy moment on each day. And you could, I love the coloured pens that I've got. It's like you could choose another colour for the following year. But I love that thought of in 5 years' time, you've got a diary with 5 story-worthy moments spread over 5 years. You could see how much you've grown. You could remember the experiences. I just adore that. I think I'll take that one on myself.
Yeah, and that diary is great. The idea comes from Matthew Dix. He's a storyteller and has written a book called Storyworthy, so that he calls it homework for life. So every day he writes down. I just love finding that diary and being able to put 5 years worth so that you can track it over a longer period of time.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I'd love to hear from you. Perhaps one of the more poignant moments where you have told a story to connect with your audience or to get a message across to your audience, and it's worked particularly well. Just to give an example to listeners about how this can work. Anything come to mind?
Yeah, I've been speaking to kahuiako and principals associations in schools, and I've been talking about connection through story. So I told a story about our daughter, Matia, and she'd gone on to intermediate, and it was right at the start of intermediate, and they had this little homework project to do, which was writing about themselves. So information about themselves. And Marty was really excited. She'd come back from the Emirates and she'd had some pretty exciting experiences, and she collected the photos and she talked to Nana and got some information about Nana, about her past and about her ancestry. And she put together this beautiful booklet. She was really engaged in it and it was fantastic. So she went along to school, and that day she came back from school and we were like, and she seemed a bit flat. We were like, well, how did it go? How did people like your story? Did you get to read it out? And she said, oh, no. She said the teacher came around with a sheet and checked that it was sitting on their desk and marked it off, and she never got to share it. And then about
Oh,
a week later, she came back from school and she said, oh, am I thick? Am I dumb? I said, oh, sweetheart, what's going on? What's that? Well, she said, I'm in the bottom reading group at school, and and am I not very good at reading? And we worked out that the reading test was shortly after that exercise that they did, and she just never connected with that teacher. And I imagine she sat in that reading test and didn't engage and was very quiet and didn't say very much at all and got marked in a low reading group as a result of that. So it's kind of a heartbreaking story, but they worked it out. They did a test a couple of weeks later and said, oh my God, she's reading 3 years above where she should be. But she never clicked with that teacher throughout the entire year, and I don't think she did as well academically because of that. But being able to tell that to a group of educators, and they recognise some of the kids in that story, and I hope none of them have ever made a mistake like that, but they just realised the value of those connections and seeing how important they are in your students, to really see them for who they are and to make those connections with them rather than leaving them feeling on the outside and not feeling like a part of your class even.
oh, absolutely. And it can happen in business where we don't realize we've shut someone down in a meeting or not asked the person who's not speaking up, is there anything you'd like to contribute? You know, they may have spent the night preparing something and they're really excited about it, but they're just so nervous to speak up. And, you know, your daughter, as with any human, when we have an experience like that, we ruminate. It's like you with your wife not answering the phone. It's like, thank you for sharing that story, because this is real life. This is where we go. We go from a missed call to a, oh, she's over there having an affair. I have to put the dog down.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
this happens. And so it's really good to be aware of the stories, not only that we're telling ourselves, but that we are sharing with other people.
One,
There's just, yeah, so much.
actually, and another thing that comes out of that, a lot of how we connect with people is through the things that we have in common. And that's, if you go into a room, you look for someone that's a little bit like you start talking about, maybe they're wearing something that suggests a sports team, or there's something about them, and you look for the people that you have in common, or maybe the work experience you have in common. And Robin Dunbar calls them pillars of friendship, and there's about 7 different ones that we search for that people have in common. But I think, particularly in a classroom situation or in a work situation, where does that leave the people that are very, very different to you, that are different
Yeah.
culturally, that look different from you, that don't have the same interests and hobbies? If you're looking to connect through those people you have in common, you've got a bias against those people immediately because you're not connecting with them. And you might say, oh, like, what have I got to do with them? I've got nothing in common with them. Well, the thing that we all have in common, the thing that we all share, is a story of how we get to be the person sitting in the seat today, being who we are. And whether that's in a workplace or anywhere else, if you can come up to someone and ask for their story, what's your story? What's it about? If you actually ask for story, then that's a great way to invite someone into your world, and you get to see life through their eyes, because it's the way they're explaining themselves and what they see of the world. Then it's a great way to draw people together and again to melt the ice between us.
Oh, I love that. And we are surrounded by diversity, which is fabulous because we've got so many different minds, but we can connect through, we all have a story.
And
We all have a story. If you have been born, you have a story, and so much happens to us. Given that this is, a podcast about making choices, so 5 a.m. Tuesday, how can we use this storytelling to, what comes to mind around when it comes to making choices specifically?
well, firstly, it's asking for story. It's when you meet someone. It's
Yes.
ask,
Yes.
hey, what is your story? what brings you here. And particularly in any kind of work environment, there's a reason, there's a story that's brought that person to be sitting in that chair at the same meeting as you that day. And if you can ask them what's brought them there, what's the story behind that, then you're starting to dig into it. And that's one really good one just to think about yourself, because at one point in life, you've been something different and been doing something different. And you become the person you are today. And maybe it's about what you're doing today. And if you think something different, and this is what I am now, at one point there's been a change. You've switched from being something different to who you are. And if you can narrow that down to a point and tell me about that point, then you really start getting into the heart of what a story is. Because a story is a decision. It's a moment of change. Which I was talking to someone that runs a not-for-profit the other day, and I asked them about the sales stories they used, because they're looking to raise funds and to get funding to continue, and they're doing a great job. And I said, well, so you weren't doing this thing previously. When was it that you realized? And it took quite a long conversation till we narrowed it down. And then she just said the name of a person, and there were tears in her eyes. And it was at that moment she knew that that was what she needed to do, and that was what she was about. And if she can tell that story to people that she's fundraising, it's real, it's authentic, it's memorable, and they're going to be drawn in, and that's really going to help her on her journey to fundraising.
Oh, absolutely. I love it. And the thing is, I'm thinking about the person who's listening, thinking, I don't have a story. And you just mentioned that with that not-for-profit person, it took a while to draw that story out of her. What would you say to the person who says, oh, I don't have a story?
Oh, everyone's got stories. If you do that homework for life, that's a great way to start to identify stories. But a story is a moment of change. It's saying, I was this thing, and now I'm this thing. And this is when that happened. And if you can narrow it down to that, and even a little bit of the thinking that happened behind that, it was, why did I think that, and now I'm this, and what was going on in my head at that moment when I changed and I saw something that I hadn't seen previously, or I felt something that I hadn't seen previously. That's a story. And you start at the opposite of that point, and you get to that point. So you start and an end, and you just got to get from one to the other. It's your story. And stories can be 30 seconds, they can be 30 minutes. It just depends on what time you've got and filling in the gaps in that journey from one point to another.
Yeah, well, there you go, listeners. No excuses. Find your story. How do we get in touch with you, Vince? What platforms are you on? I'll put some links in, but what's the best way?
LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn, or my website's just vinceford.org, and all of my contact details. Yeah, all my contact details are there. I'm really happy to talk to people if they want some coaching or running workshops within organisations, and I'll start to have some workshops up in the next couple of months that people can opt into. And we can do that on Zoom, or we can do it in person, because there is something about being in person. You can do these things on Zoom, but being in the same room at the same time with someone is hugely beneficial, and that's something I love to do too.
Oh, I completely agree. And given that you're all about connecting through story, it's like it's in our DNA to want that connection. I'm just so delighted to have had you on here. I want to explore the writing down a memory each day, and thinking about some of the stories in my own life. Is there any final words of wisdom you want to share with listeners before we wind up?
Oh, just maybe it's that homework for life. Maybe it's saying, actually, just every night, think back, jot one thing down, and start to see some of the richness. And I know that I've changed since I've started this journey, just seeing those connections and walking into any situation with a bit more positivity. Actually, one thing I want to say, Nick Epley did a study with commuters in Chicago, and those people, and he got students to walk onto a train and to engage and talk to strangers. They called it mistakenly seeking solitude was the name of the study. And they found that both the students and the people that they talked to invariably they enjoyed that trip more when they connected with a human being on that trip. And this is Chicago. It's not the friendliest looking city in the world. So step out there and actually realize that people do want to hear from you and people do want to interact with you, because that's
Oh,
what
they do.
life's all about.
Yeah, they really do. I was flying home in, oh, what month are we up to? I was flying home in June, and the guy sitting next to me, we started chatting. We chatted on and off for a lot of the flight. It was a long haul flight. And I'll tell you what, I said to him at the end, I said, thank you. Thank you for being one of those people that's open to having a conversation, because so often you hop on a flight, same as a bus or a train, and people have got their earplugs in, we don't connect anymore. So listeners, there's so much gold to take from that. Yeah, we've got our heads down on our
Yeah,
phones.
yeah,
Oh my gosh.
yeah. Put those away. Say hello to the person next to you. It could take you anywhere.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'll put your details below. Good luck with finishing your fabulous book, and I'll certainly be looking out for it. So we'll stay in touch. And yeah, really appreciate you joining me as a guest.
Thanks, Brenda. It's been wonderful.